Owner has no idea why hot dogs don't sell, so he goes undercover and finds sausages stored with Rodent. Harlan stepped into the store dressed as one of the employees, blending in with the background. The door creaked shut behind him, and the atmosphere immediately hit him cold, lifeless. The store, once bustling with energy, felt like a shell of itself. Employees moved with no urgency, their faces tired and vacant as though they had lost their drive long ago. The silence was suffocating. The register sat untouched, the chairs scattered carelessly at tables. No customers, no life, just a hollow, forgotten place. Harlan's gaze swept over the scene, frustration welling up inside him. This wasn't the business he had built, and it wasn't the future he had planned. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right. His frustration reached its peak, but he couldn't pinpoint the cause. His jaw clenched. He had to find out why. Without a second thought, he made a decision he would work undercover as one of them to uncover the truth. This was no longer just about a failing business. It was about finding the heart of the problem. If you've ever been frustrated by something at work, this video is for you. Drop a comment and let's discuss. Harlan slipped into the rhythm of his new role as a server, his presence unnoticed by those around him. The store buzzed with a stagnant energy. The employees moved in slow, uncoordinated motions, performing their tasks without any enthusiasm or urgency. The hum of the register was absent, as was any semblance of a thriving business. Harlan's gaze shifted to the sausage containers stacked carelessly on the shelf, the packaging worn and uneven. He noticed the temperature gauge for the storage area flickering, barely functioning. There was a distinct sense of disregard. He couldn't help but feel a growing unease. Something wasn't right, but it was difficult to pinpoint exactly what. He moved quietly, observing the small details that seemed to tell a bigger story. The air felt heavy, and the silence between the staff was deafening. His suspicions began to solidify the quality of the product, the standard of the work. It all seemed far from the brand he had built. He wasn't sure if it was negligence or a deeper problem, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to dig deeper, but the question lingered. Why was no one else seeing this? Harlan moved to engage with the staff, trying to get a feel for the dynamics of the place. His first interaction was with Lana, a server with a sharp edge to her demeanor. As she handed him a drink, she glanced at him with a smirk and muttered, "Guess you don't tip well anyway." The words struck him harder than he expected. It wasn't just a casual remark, it was a reflection of something deeper, a lack of respect, a disregard for the job. The employees moved about, too wrapped up in their own discontent to pay attention to the customers or the quality of service they were supposed to provide. Harlan watched as a few ignored orders, others lazily wiped down tables, their minds clearly elsewhere. It wasn't just the sloppiness of their work. It was the indifference, the absence of any pride in the job. There was no passion, no ownership in what they did. Lana's comment was a window into a toxic environment, a culture that had seeped into the bones of this place. It was a reflection of something much larger, and Harlan's heart sank as he began to understand the extent of the problem. The discomfort Harlan had been feeling grew as he continued his inspection until he finally found something that hit him hard. The sausages, once his pride and joy, were now a shadow of their former quality. He took one out of the container, his fingers brushing against the package, noting its uneven texture. The smell hit him before he even looked closely. Rancid. The once vibrant color of the sausage had dulled, replaced by an off-putting gray. Harlan felt a wave of disbelief and disgust. He stared at the product in his hand as if it might somehow change back to the pristine version he was used to. This was not the standard he had built his business on, and the realization hit him like a cold slap. How had this happened under his watch? How had things deteriorated so badly? His chest tightened with anger, the weight of it sinking deep into his gut. But beneath the anger, there was something else, an urge to understand. This wasn't just about poor product, it was about the system that allowed this to happen. Harlan's mind shifted from frustration to determination. He had to find the root cause, and he wasn't going to stop until he had answers. Harlan's investigation took a deeper turn as he approached a few more employees asking about the procedures for product storage and quality control. The answers were disheartening. One worker, John, casually mentioned that no one had ever really explained the standards for sanitation or proper storage. It was clear to Harlan that employees were not given the right training, not because they didn't care, but because the system itself had failed them. He felt a deep sense of disappointment, a realization that the issue wasn't just poor attitudes or lazy work, it was rooted in the core of the operation. The training programs were inadequate, and without proper guidance there was no structure to hold anyone accountable. As he walked through the aisles, Harlan's mind raced with thoughts of how this was allowed to happen under his watch. He realized the problem was much bigger than just bad practices. It was a failure in management and leadership. He now understood that addressing the symptoms wouldn't be enough. The root cause had to be exposed and fixed. With a renewed sense of determination, Harlan knew that his next step had to be understanding how deeply this lack of structure ran and how to fix it. The more Harlan observed, the more he saw. In the kitchen, some employees were simply going through the motions, barely paying attention to their actions. He saw one worker prepare food without washing their hands, another dropping meat onto the floor and continuing without hesitation. The lack of care was everywhere, from the way they handled food to their disregard for cleanliness. Harlan's frustration grew with each passing minute. He had hoped that the problem was an isolated one, a few bad apples. But it was more than that. It was an entire culture of negligence, a reflection of a system that had allowed this behavior to persist. Harlan's hands clenched at his sides as he watched one careless mistake after another. His mind snapped into focus. This wasn't the fault of a few employees. This was a company-wide failure. The attitude of these workers wasn't just a personal flaw, it was the product of a broken system. Harlan's heart raced as he made a decision. He could no longer sit idly by. The change he had to initiate couldn't wait. The store's future depended on it. Harlan approached Mike, a worker at the counter who seemed more attentive than the rest. As they spoke, Mike confirmed the very thing Harlan had been suspecting: there was no clear process for quality control. "We just do what we're told," Mike explained casually, as if it was nothing unusual. There was no structure, no defined process to monitor and ensure the products were safe and up to standard. Harlan felt a sharp pang of frustration. This wasn't just about employees cutting corners. It was the absence of any proper oversight. The lack of a management system, the lack of clear guidelines, was the root of it all. Harlan's mind began to piece everything together. The careless handling of products, the lack of customer care, the neglect in hygiene, it all stemmed from a broken system. He had hoped for an easy fix, but the reality was harder to digest. The deeper he went, the more he realized that what he had built was not the cause of the problems. The company itself had failed to create an environment of responsibility. The way forward was clear. Now Harlan had to overhaul not just the employees but the very foundations of the company. The real work was about to begin. Harlan's frustration reached a boiling point as he watched the chaos unfold before him. Employees trickled in late, some not showing up at all. The few who did were sluggish, their faces devoid of energy or care. One worker was too busy chatting with a colleague to even notice a customer waiting, while another rolled their eyes when asked to help. This wasn't just laziness, it was a complete disregard for their responsibilities. Harlan stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. How could this be happening? Was this how things had always been? He could feel the weight of his anger growing, his chest tightening as the store seemed to fall apart around him. This was not what he had built. It was a far cry from the company he envisioned. The time for ignoring these problems was over. If the employees couldn't get it together, what did that say about the leadership above them? The thought gnawed at him. The problem ran deeper than just a few bad workers. It was a systemic failure, a lack of respect for their roles, for the business, and for each other. Something had to change, and it had to happen now. Feeling the weight of his decision, Harlan sought out John, the store manager. The moment they sat down, Harlan's questions came fast. "What's the process for training these employees?" How do we ensure quality control? John's response was vague, his words lackluster. We just do what we can with what we have, he said, shrugging dismissively. Harlan's mind churned as he listened. The answers felt like nothing more than excuses, and Harlan knew this wasn't the first time he'd heard them. It was the same complacency, the same tired answers. John's inability to provide clear direction only confirmed Harlan's growing suspicion the management was just as lost as the employees. The company wasn't being led. It was drifting aimlessly. Disappointment settled into Harlan's bones. He had hoped for someone to step up to show a little leadership, but what he found was a manager just as indifferent as the rest. His frustration surged, and a realization hit him like a cold wave. This problem was far bigger than the workers on the floor. It was a failure that stretched all the way up, and he knew he had to act. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Harlan's shoulders. But instead of reacting with more anger, he decided on a different approach. He wasn't about to give up on this store just yet. He called a meeting with the staff, his tone firm but clear. "I'm giving you all a second chance," he announced, his voice cutting through the stale air. "We're going to improve, but this time it's not optional. I'll be rolling out a full retraining program: quality control, sanitation, customer service. You will learn everything you should have from the start." As Harlan spoke, the room remained eerily silent. But he could see the flickers of recognition in some faces, others, though, seemed unaffected, still lost in their own worlds. He wasn't sure how many would rise to the challenge, but he knew he had to give them the opportunity to prove themselves. This wasn't just about fixing the store, it was about fixing the mindset that had taken root here. He was determined to steer the ship back on course no matter the resistance. Hope and resolve filled him. This was the beginning of real change, and he wasn't backing down now. Harlan observed the team carefully after the retraining sessions. The initial spark of hope that had ignited in him now felt fragile. A few employees were starting to show real improvements. Maria's once lackluster efforts were now focused, and Josh had begun greeting customers with a genuine smile rather than the empty gestures of before. These small victories gave him some relief, a glimmer of the change he had hoped for. But the progress was uneven. There were still workers who drifted through their tasks, their disinterest palpable. One man, Greg, continued to arrive late, and Emma, despite the training, still seemed indifferent, her gaze distant as she wiped down tables without any real care. Harlan felt the weight of the contradictions, the rising frustration. How could some embrace the change while others resisted so stubbornly? The disparity was hard to ignore. There were moments of hope, but they were tempered by disappointment, the stark reality that not everyone was willing to improve. He couldn't ignore the shift in the air. This wasn't a seamless transformation. Some employees had made progress, but the battle wasn't over. The store's future, Harlan realized, still hung in the balance, contingent on the commitment of each individual. The tension had been building, and it finally broke. Harlan found himself face to face with Greg, the employee who had refused to change. It was impossible to ignore anymore the late arrivals, the half-hearted efforts, the blatant disrespect for the job. "You think you can just skate by, don't you?" Harlan's voice was sharp, cutting through the dissonance that had settled between them. Greg's eyes flickered with defiance, a smile twisting on his lips. "What's the problem? I'm here, aren't I?" The exchange was electric. Harlan's patience finally snapping. It was clear now Greg's attitude was a symptom of something deeper, an ingrained belief that he could get away with doing the bare minimum. The confrontation was inevitable. Harlan's heart pounded as the words left his mouth. "I'm not here to babysit. If you don't care enough to do the job right, then you don't belong here." Greg's face hardened, but Harlan felt something else, a sense of clarity. There was no more room for compromise. The air between them was thick with animosity, but it was in this moment that Harlan realized the weight of the decision he had to make. There was no turning back now. The decision was made, and it was as final as it was necessary. Harlan watched Greg pack up his things, the anger in his eyes unchanged, but there was no room for debate. The store had reached a breaking point, and Harlan's leadership could not bend in the face of it. As Greg left, Harlan stood at the front of the room facing his team, the weight of the moment sinking in. "This is the new standard," he said, his voice unwavering. "We are moving forward, and if you're not with us, you're out. No more excuses." The finality of his words hung in the air. The store would not survive if it continued to limp along on the backs of those unwilling to give their best. It wasn't just about one employee, it was about the whole culture of the company, and Harlan had just made the choice to shift it. His voice rang with conviction as he spoke again. "We start fresh. Every one of you is being held accountable for what happens here. If we're going to do this, we do it together, or we don't do it at all." As he surveyed the room, the energy shifted. There was no room for complacency anymore. There was only one way forward, determined, focused, and unified. Harlan felt a sense of relief. The moment of decision had passed, and now it was time to rebuild. The room fell silent as Harlan stood before the remaining staff. After the dismissal of Greg, he knew he had to address the team. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, but Harlan wasn't here to scold. He was here to lead. "This is the beginning of a new chapter," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "We've lost ground, but we can take it back. We all have a role to play, and I expect each of you to take this seriously. We need to work together to turn this around, no more excuses." The room was tense, but Harlan could see the flickers of understanding in some faces. They knew the store's future depended on their efforts, and they knew Harlan wasn't going to let it slide. He laid out a clear plan for the changes ahead, detailing the goals, the new training schedules, and the expectations for each individual. His sincerity was palpable, and though the path ahead would be hard, there was something in his words that began to spark a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about fixing the store, it was about restoring their pride in their work. "We can do this," Harlan finished, his voice carrying a promise. And as he looked out over the room, he felt the first stirrings of belief that maybe, just maybe, this was the fresh start they all needed. The days following the meeting were filled with small but noticeable changes. Harlan kept a close eye on the team, carefully observing how the employees responded to the new expectations. It was clear that some had taken the message to heart. Maria worked with a new determination, wiping down tables and greeting customers with a warmth she had never shown before. Josh, who had once seemed content to do the bare minimum, was now going the extra mile, engaging with customers and ensuring that everything was in place. The store itself felt cleaner, more organized, as if the atmosphere had shifted along with the staff. Harlan couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, though he knew better than to think it was over. There were still moments of hesitation, some workers still struggling to meet the new standard. But the customers noticed. They started to return their presence, a clear sign that the improvements were not just visible to Harlan but to those who mattered most. A sense of optimism began to settle into Harlan's chest. The changes were starting to take root, and the early signs were promising. He could see the foundation being built, but he knew there was still more work to do. This was just the beginning. As Harlan continued to monitor the store, it became evident that the improvements were not just temporary. A few employees like Maria and Josh had fully embraced the new standards, their work ethic now a far cry from where it had been before. The quality of service had increased, and it was becoming more apparent every day. But, as with any change, not everyone was equally committed. Some employees showed progress, but others, like Emma, still displayed the same lethargic attitude. She was performing her duties, but without the spark that had begun to ignite in others. It was a pattern that was difficult to ignore, the gap between those who had embraced the transformation and those who hadn't. Harlan felt a flicker of frustration, but he also understood it wasn't going to happen overnight. The path ahead was still long, and not everyone was ready to walk it. But there was hope. For the first time, Harlan saw a team that had the potential to work together to truly change. The question now wasn't whether it could happen, it was how far he could push them, how much they were willing to give. He felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing the progress, but he knew that there was still more to come. The journey was just beginning, and the next steps would determine whether this newfound energy would be sustained or falter. Harlan stood before his team, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The changes so far had begun to show promise, but he knew the work wasn't nearly done. He wasn't willing to settle for incremental improvements. "We need stricter quality control," he told them, the certainty in his voice cutting through the air. "And I'll be implementing regular training sessions from now on. We're not just doing this for the customers, we're doing it for ourselves." The decision to take things further wasn't an easy one. Harlan understood that it meant more time, more effort, but the foundation was finally solid. It was time to build something that would last. He wasn't just going to address the surface issues, he would go deeper, reshaping the very core of the store's culture. Harlan made sure the work environment was improving, too. Employees were encouraged to voice concerns, and the physical space was rearranged for better flow. He knew that making the work environment comfortable would foster a sense of ownership among his staff. But as he spoke, he could see their reactions. Some were unsure, but a few faces lit up with hope. The future was beginning to take shape, and Harlan felt a surge of energy. The store was transforming, and so were the people in it. Despite the progress, Harlan couldn't ignore the glaring issues that remained. The changes, though promising, were still fragile. Not all employees had embraced the shift. Some of them still stumbled through the motions, their lack of effort too obvious to overlook. And then there were the customers. While some had noticed the improvements, others still complained about the same old problems: slow service, mediocre quality. Harlan stood in the middle of the store, the noise of the day swarming around him, yet all he could focus on was the underlying tension. How much longer could this last? How many more setbacks could the company endure before it completely turned around? He knew that change was never easy, that real transformation took time, but the constant setbacks felt like a weight he couldn't shake off. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, the doubts creeping in. Was he pushing too hard, too fast? Could the team really pull together? Every improvement seemed to come with a new challenge, and the constant back and forth was beginning to wear on him. The tension was palpable, a constant reminder that change was a slow and painful process. But even as the challenges mounted, Harlan refused to give up. He couldn't afford to. The road ahead was difficult, but it was the only road that mattered. As the weeks went by, Harlan began to see the slow but steady progress he had been hoping for. It wasn't all at once, but the changes were undeniable. More employees were showing up on time, taking their responsibilities seriously. Maria, who had once seemed disengaged, now asked questions, eager to learn more. Josh had begun taking pride in his work, ensuring every corner of the store was clean and every customer was greeted warmly. The transformation wasn't just in the actions, it was in the atmosphere too. The store felt more alive, more focused, as if everyone could sense the change that was taking root. And then there were the customers. They were starting to come back. Slowly but surely they were returning, their expressions lighter, their satisfaction clear. Harlan could feel it, a shift that started deep within the store's culture. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to face, but the momentum had begun to build. It wasn't just about ticking off boxes anymore. It was about a genuine transformation, one that could be sustained. For the first time in a while, Harlan allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. The work was paying off bit by bit, and there was hope that the store was finally moving in the right direction. The air in the store shifted when Sarah walked in. She was a new higher, fresh energy in a place that had long been stagnating. Harlan could feel the difference the moment she started. Her enthusiasm was contagious, infecting the staff in a way that Harlan hadn't seen in weeks. She moved with purpose, her smile genuine, her attitude focused. Sarah didn't just work hard, she set an example, motivating the others around her. The change wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Employees who had once been sluggish began to pick up the pace. Maria, who had been reserved, now spoke up in team meetings, offering suggestions and feedback. Josh seemed to find a new sense of pride in his work, making sure each customer was treated with care. Harlan watched all of this quietly, observing the subtle but powerful shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just Sarah's work ethic, it was her spirit, her belief that things could be better, that was sparking change in the team. For the first time in a while, Harlan felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was the catalyst they needed. Sarah had breathed life into a place that had been suffocating, and Harlan knew that her presence would push the store closer to the future he had imagined. With Sarah's influence beginning to show, Harlan knew it was time to test the waters with something more concrete. He gathered the team and unveiled his new plan, a strategy designed to attract more customers. This would be the real test of the changes they had worked so hard to implement. Harlan decided to roll out a limited-time discount combined with an enhanced menu and improved customer service. He assigned key employees to monitor the campaign, giving them the responsibility of ensuring its success. There was a buzz of excitement as the team rallied together, ready to put their efforts to the test. But beneath the surface, Harlan couldn't shake the anxiety building in his chest. This was a calculated risk. If it worked, the store would see a surge in customers. If it didn't, it would be a setback, one that could unravel everything they had built so far. As the discount period began, Harlan kept a close eye on every detail. Would customers notice the difference? Would the improvements they'd made be enough to draw people in? The tension was palpable, and with every passing hour his hope and doubt battled within him. This was the moment of truth. The results were nothing short of transformative. As the discount campaign continued, Harlan watched the numbers climb. Foot traffic increased, and more importantly, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Customers were impressed with the quality of the service, the atmosphere of the store, and the freshness of the products. Many returned, and some even brought friends, spreading the word about the changes. The success wasn't just in the sales figures, it was in the energy that had returned to the store. Employees worked with renewed vigor, their pride evident in the care they took with every task. Harlan could feel the weight lift off his shoulders as the results spoke for themselves. It wasn't just about the discount, it was about everything they had done to improve the overall experience. He stood in the center of the store, watching his team interact with customers, feeling a deep sense of pride. This wasn't just a fleeting success, it was proof that the changes were real and they could last. For the first time in a long while, Harlan allowed himself to believe that they had truly turned a corner. The future looked brighter than ever, and he was finally seeing the fruits of the work they had put in. The success felt earned, and it was just the beginning. Harlan knew that to build something lasting, he needed to push beyond the walls of this one store. With the success of the initial changes, it was time to scale. He decided to expand, implementing the improved processes and training programs across all branches. It wasn't just about more stores, it was about consistency. Harlan focused on the detailed, standardized training for each employee, a renewed emphasis on customer service, and a fresh approach to management. He personally oversaw the integration of the new systems, determined to ensure that the momentum he had built wouldn't falter. The road ahead was challenging. There were systems to standardize, teams to motivate, and the pressure of replicating the success of one store across many. But in every decision Harlan made, there was a sense of purpose. He could see the potential in each new location, feel the energy of the growing business, and knew that with the right approach, this could be just the beginning. The store's identity was no longer just a reflection of him. It was something bigger. Harlan's vision was expanding, and with it the opportunity to reach more people, provide more jobs, and change more lives. This was his chance to build a legacy, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As the expansion unfolded, Harlan found that growth wasn't without its complications. While the new stores showed promise, the same problems that had plagued the original store began to surface again. Employee turnover became a pressing issue. Some of the new hires didn't adapt to the culture as easily as the original team had. Once again, Harlan faced issues with consistency. Some branches struggled to meet the standard he had set. In one location, employees failed to follow the new protocols, and in another, the customer experience was lackluster. The anxiety that had faded for a while began creeping back into Harlan's chest. These were the same issues he had worked so hard to eliminate. The pressure of replicating success in every branch weighed on him, but he refused to let it pull him down. He had built this, and he would fix it. The difficulty of expansion was undeniable. He couldn't simply expect things to fall into place. The old challenges were a constant reminder that growth demanded constant attention. But Harlan wasn't discouraged. If anything, the presence of these problems only strengthened his resolve to make the changes stick. There was no turning back now. He had to address these challenges head-on, just as he had with the original store. Harlan sat in his office looking at the reports. The successes, the failures, everything on paper was clear. The expansion had potential, but the cracks were still visible. It was time to act. He made the decision to tighten the processes even further, implementing even stricter standards across all locations. There would be no room for complacency. He rolled out additional training sessions, scheduled regular reviews, and re-emphasized the importance of teamwork and customer care. Harlan made it clear that this wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement. Each store, each employee had to be on the same page. It wasn't just about meeting a minimum standard anymore, it was about exceeding expectations. He believed in the team he had built, but he knew they needed more structure, more discipline to maintain the quality they had started with. His voice, unwavering, echoed through the meetings he held with the managers. This is it. No more second chances. We either get it right or we don't. The challenge had become clear to him now. It was no longer about fixing the store. It was about maintaining the integrity of what they had built across every branch. His decision was final, and with it came a new chapter of responsibility and accountability. Harlan felt the weight of his decision, but there was satisfaction in the clarity it brought. He would not stop until the company was a reflection of everything he knew it could be. The first signs of improvement were slow but unmistakable. Harlan watched the numbers climb ever so slightly, a quiet but meaningful shift. The revenue had ticked upward, small but consistent, signaling a change was taking place. It wasn't the explosive turnaround he had hoped for, but it was something. What mattered most was that customers were returning. Slowly at first, but they came back drawn in by the fresh energy that was starting to fill the space. The store felt different, cleaner, more vibrant, as if it had shed its old skin. Harlan noticed it in the way employees interacted with customers and the way the atmosphere had lifted. There was a palpable sense of progress in the air. Still, Harlan wasn't ready to celebrate. The improvements, though promising, were still fragile. He knew that a small uptick in sales wasn't enough to declare victory, but it was a sign that the changes he'd pushed for were beginning to take root. And though the results were modest, they were enough to reignite his belief that this could work. He could feel the momentum building, but he also knew that more work lay ahead. This was just the beginning. Harlan wasn't one to rest on small victories. The results so far were promising, but he wasn't going to stop there. He decided to ramp up the efforts. A new strategy was put into place: larger promotional events, targeted discounts, and further product improvements. He hoped these changes would draw in even more customers, solidifying the progress they had made. The idea of running a larger campaign was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Harlan's mind raced with possibilities. What if the results weren't as good as he hoped? What if, after all the work and effort, the customers didn't respond as they had before? But he had no choice but to push forward. The risks were high, but the potential rewards were even higher. Harlan spent long hours working on the details, ensuring that every element of the strategy was in place. The pressure mounted with every passing day, but there was no turning back now. The stakes were higher and the anxiety crept in, but Harlan knew that this was the next step in solidifying the store's place in the market. This was more than a test of strategy. It was a test of how deeply the changes had taken hold. The results were clear almost immediately. Customer feedback flooded in, and it was overwhelmingly positive. They noticed the difference, the improvements in service, the quality of the products, the attention to detail. Word spread, and more customers returned, bringing their friends, sharing their positive experiences. The store felt alive again, buzzing with the energy of satisfied patrons. Harlan's heart swelled with pride as he read through the glowing reviews. It was a moment of validation. The effort had been worth it. Yet, even as he felt satisfaction, there was an underlying sense of something unfinished. The results were good, but Harlan had always set his standards higher. He could see that the store was on the right path, but there were still gaps to close. Not every customer was completely satisfied. There were still moments where the service faltered, where the experience wasn't seamless. Harlan knew he couldn't stop now. The improvements were a step in the right direction, but they weren't enough. He was happy with the progress, but he felt a nagging sense of urgency to continue to refine, to perfect. He was getting closer, but he wasn't there yet. There was still work to be done. Harlan walked through the store, his mind heavy with the weight of his decisions. As he observed his employees, the nagging realization hit him hard. Some of the old issues had resurfaced. A few of the staff members, despite all the training and changes, continued to defy the new standards. They arrived late, their work unmotivated, their attitude unchanged. It was as though nothing had been learned, as if the reset hadn't taken place at all. The frustration welled up inside Harlan, a bitter reminder of how far he still had to go. His eyes scanned the floor. Maria was still too distracted. Greg's work ethic had barely improved, and even Sarah, with her energy and drive, had begun slipping into old habits. It was the same fight again. Harlan had poured his energy into this, but now it seemed that some employees still couldn't see the bigger picture. How could he ensure the changes would last if this resistance continued? His mind raced. He couldn't afford to let these lingering problems sabotage all the progress. Harlan had to face a difficult truth. The battle wasn't over. It wasn't just about improving. It was about maintaining, about making sure that the company never fell back into its old bad habits. The moment Harlan had been dreading arrived. After observing the same issues crop up again, he knew what had to be done. He couldn't allow the store to slip back into chaos. It was time to make the tough call. He called a meeting with the employees. He had been keeping an eye on the ones who still refused to adapt, the ones who continued to drag the company down. "This ends now," Harlan said, his voice firm without hesitation. The air in the room thickened with tension. There were no more second chances. Harlan couldn't afford to risk the store's success because of a few who still didn't care. If you can't follow the standards we've set, if you can't respect the rules of this business, then you're not a part of this team anymore. As he fired the employees, the sense of finality was deafening. Harlan's decision was harsh, but necessary. He knew that for the store to thrive, there could be no room for complacency. His decision wasn't made lightly, but it was clear. The vision for the store was bigger than any one person, and if they couldn't step up, they had to go. A calm settled in as Harlan stood in front of the remaining staff. His resolve was unshakable. It was time to move forward with or without the ones unwilling to change. With the staff trimmed and the systems in place, Harlan thought the worst was behind him. But the expansion to new locations was not without its own set of challenges. The new branches, though full of potential, were struggling. The staff they had hired simply couldn't meet the standards set by the flagship store. There was a glaring lack of experienced workers, and the quality was starting to slip. Harlan could feel the weight of the growing business pressing on his shoulders as he visited each branch. There were constant issues with staffing, too many inexperienced faces, too few skilled hands. The initial excitement of opening new locations quickly turned to frustration as Harlan realized how difficult it would be to maintain consistency across the board. Some stores still lacked the energy and quality that had made the original store successful. The challenges that he had faced before were now multiplied, and it felt like he was constantly putting out fires. Harlan walked through the new stores, assessing the damage, his disappointment growing with each step. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, this growth could turn into a failure. The dream of expanding was turning into a nightmare, and Harlan felt the tension rise once again. This was the hardest test yet, and he couldn't afford to fail. Harlan's patience was wearing thin as he stood before the group of managers from the newly opened branches. The issues were clear. Employees were still struggling to meet the standards he had set, and the same mistakes were happening again and again. The store's reputation hung by a thread, and Harlan knew it was time to make adjustments. He called a meeting, a series of group sessions where the problems could be tackled head-on. There was no more room for excuses. His voice, firm but composed, guided the team through the necessary steps to bring the branches back in line. The process wasn't easy. Each conversation felt like a weight on Harlan's shoulders. He had come to realize that change wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing process that required constant vigilance. He pushed for more training, more hands-on supervision, and clearer communication. Harlan felt the strain of his responsibility grow heavier with each meeting, but he refused to back down. He couldn't afford to. As the meetings went on, some of the managers began to show signs of understanding. But in the back of Harlan's mind, he knew that these adjustments would only be effective if every employee embraced them. He had done the hard work of laying the foundation. Now it was time to see if it could truly hold. Days turned into weeks, and Harlan found himself stepping back, reflecting on the bigger picture. The changes were taking root, but the process felt more like a marathon than a sprint. He sat in his office reviewing the progress reports from all the branches, noting both the improvements and the setbacks. The numbers were slightly better, the feedback from customers more positive, but something inside Harlan told him it wasn't enough yet. The company had come a long way, but it wasn't perfect. Change, he realized, wasn't a one-off effort. It was an ongoing journey. There was still room to grow, still work to be done. Harlan was determined to stay the course, but he knew that he couldn't afford to lose sight of the bigger picture. Every small change had to be part of a greater transformation. He began to plan for the next phase, analyzing what had worked and what still needed attention. Harlan felt the weight of his decisions more than ever, but beneath the exhaustion was a quiet, steady resolve. This was far from over. The road ahead would demand more of him and his team, but Harlan was ready. It wasn't just about making things better. It was about ensuring that this success was sustainable, that the company could continue to grow and evolve. The shifts Harlan had been working toward were beginning to manifest in the most unexpected of ways. Slowly but surely, some employees were beginning to change their attitudes. It wasn't just about doing the job anymore. It was about doing it well, with passion, with a sense of ownership. Maria, who had been quiet and withdrawn, now spoke up in team meetings, suggesting ways to improve the workflow. Josh, once indifferent, now offered to stay late to help clean up or make sure customers were satisfied. It wasn't just a change in behavior, it was a shift in spirit. The store felt different, more alive. There was a collective energy now, a sense of pride that hadn't been there before. Sarah, with her boundless enthusiasm, had helped spark this change, but it was the employees themselves who had taken it and run with it. Ideas flowed more freely, and there was a palpable sense of optimism in the air. Harlan couldn't help but smile as he watched his team at work. They were more than just employees now. They were part of something bigger, something that they had all built together. The store, once on the brink of collapse, was now a place of renewal, a place full of energy, creativity, and a renewed sense of purpose. Harlan knew there was still more to do, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sense of satisfaction. This was the beginning of something new. Harlan leaned back in his chair, the reports spread out in front of him. He studied the numbers carefully, the slight rise in revenue, the steady flow of returning customers. The growth was modest, but it was undeniable. The branches that had once seemed like a risky experiment were now stabilizing, each one starting to find its rhythm. Harlan couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction wash over him. He had put everything into this transformation, the late nights, the tough decisions, the relentless pushing, and now he was seeing the fruits of those efforts. The store's atmosphere was shifting, too. There was a buzz of activity, a sense of purpose in the air. Employees were more engaged, more committed to the quality of their work. Harlan knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while he felt confident that the foundation was solid. The changes were beginning to take hold, and the stability he had longed for was finally becoming a reality. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And that for Harlan was enough. The road to success was never easy, but this felt like a moment to breathe, to appreciate how far they had come. His vision was finally taking shape, and he could see the future ahead. The hum of activity in the store had become a familiar, comforting sound. Harlan walked through the aisles, taking in the small, subtle changes. The staff moved with purpose, now their attitudes shifting from apathy to determination. There was no longer a sense of dragging through the day. Everyone was working harder with more pride in what they were doing. The customers noticed, too. Harlan saw them walking through the door with smiles on their faces, exchanging pleasantries with employees who greeted them warmly. The atmosphere had completely transformed. It felt like a fresh start, a new beginning, and for the first time in months, Harlan could see his vision taking root. The stores were no longer struggling to stay afloat. They were operating smoothly, efficiently. The goals he had set were within reach. There was still work to be done, but the changes were beginning to feel permanent. For Harlan, this was the moment he had been working toward. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about creating something better. As he watched the staff working together, laughing, helping each other, he felt a sense of pride that was hard to describe. They had come so far, and now everything seemed to be falling into place. The moment had arrived. Harlan stood before his team, a quiet sense of anticipation hanging in the air. They had worked hard, had changed so much, and now it was time for the truth to come out. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice steady. "I'm not just your manager. I'm the owner of this store." The words hung in the room, heavy with the weight of their revelation. For a few seconds there was nothing but stunned silence. Then, as the truth sank in, Harlan saw the shock on their faces, followed by a slow, dawning realization. They had been working alongside the very person who had watched them struggle, who had been behind the decisions that had changed everything. The room filled with a mix of emotions, surprise, confusion, and then something else. Gratitude. Harlan continued, "I want to thank you all for everything you've done. This place has changed because of you, and I'm proud of each and every one of you." The employees looked at each other, a sense of camaraderie forming where once there had been uncertainty. Some smiled, others stood in awe, but all of them shared one thing: pride. The truth had set a new foundation, and Harlan could feel the change in the room. It wasn't just a revelation, it was the beginning of something stronger, something united. After revealing his true identity, Harlan felt a shift in the room. The staff, initially shocked, now wore expressions of disbelief mixed with growing appreciation. He looked around, locking eyes with the employees who had been pivotal in this journey. "You've all worked hard, and it hasn't gone unnoticed." Harlan said, his voice steady but filled with pride. He handed out rewards, small bonuses, recognition certificates, and watched as the realization sank in: their efforts had truly paid off. Maria's eyes brightened with surprise. Josh cracked a rare smile, and Sarah looked around as if seeing her work in a new light. For the first time, they understood the weight of what they'd accomplished, and it wasn't just Harlan's success, it was theirs too. The atmosphere, once thick with tension, now hummed with satisfaction. There was joy in the air as Harlan saw his employees no longer just workers but contributors to something greater. This was the culmination of their hard work, the acknowledgement that they had turned things around together. Weeks of tireless effort, adjustments, and challenges had led to this moment. The store was back on track, and so was the team. Harlan walked through the aisles with a sense of quiet pride. The place felt stable, orderly, efficient, and with a team that was finally in sync. The employees, once distracted or disinterested, now moved with purpose, interacting with customers with genuine care. The store hummed with a new energy, one that wasn't forced, but earned. Harlan could see the change in the faces around him. They had adapted, they had grown, and now they understood the value of their work. He watched as they performed tasks with a sense of pride, just as he had always envisioned. The store wasn't just functioning, it was thriving. Harlan felt a deep satisfaction as he realized the transformation wasn't just about policies and training, it was about people. This wasn't just the end of a project. It was the beginning of something lasting. The journey had been long, but it had paid off, and he knew this was just the beginning. The room buzzed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the warmth of shared success. Harlan sat among his team not as a boss, but as a peer, surrounded by the very people who had helped turn the store around. This wasn't just a celebration of numbers, it was a celebration of transformation, of hard work paying off. The air was filled with hope. They had done it together. Harlan looked around, feeling a quiet pride. This moment wasn't just about a job well done, it was proof that with the right people and commitment, anything was possible. The future was bright, and they knew it.